They buried her twice, once by law, and once because the first time didn't work. Her name was Clara Hensley, though the holler itself seemed to resist uttering it. Ash Hollow, tucked deep in the folds of the Virginia Appalachians, was a place where time moved unevenly, where the sun's warmth never fully reached the valley floor, and where the fog settled into the trees as if it were a living presence, unwilling to leave. No records exist that clearly document Clara's life before she arrived. She appeared one spring morning in 1884, coming down from the roads that led to Richmond, carrying little more than a satchel and the careful posture of a woman who understood both how to appear polite and how to avoid curiosity. Yet curiosity followed her regardless. The children of the miners' families were the first to notice her, whispering among themselves that her eyes held a softness unlike the hard edges of their fathers, a quiet that suggested she listened to more than she revealed. Adults, too, sensed her presence as something that unsettled the ordinary rhythm of their lives. They were careful around her, polite to the point of discomfort, but always alert, as if aware that the mountains themselves were watching, waiting for some unspoken event to unfold. The holler itself seemed to bend around Clara. The paths she took to the small schoolhouse shifted subtly in her absence. A rock that had been firm yesterday appeared loose. A fence post leaned differently. A door that had been closed the night before creaked open without explanation. The townsfolk attributed these things to wind, animals, or forgetfulness, but none of them could entirely explain the sensation that followed her steps, that pressed on the chest of anyone who lingered too long in her presence. Even the dogs avoided the edges of her path, their ears flat, low growls vibrating in the cool air. She moved with care, teaching the children to read and write, to count, to learn the small things that might carry them beyond the holler. And yet always she seemed part of the shadows, as if she understood the holler's tendency to swallow the living whole. She would walk home along the ridge road at dusk, lantern in hand, her figure small against the dense thicket, and the mist would curl around her like fingers, obscuring her entirely before she reached the cabin at the edge of town, where she had rented a small room from Mrs. Calloway, a widow who had lived alone for 20 years and spoke to no one for the majority of each day. No one understood why Clara drew attention, but she did. The valley remembered her, the soil remembered her, and the fog carried her name quietly to those who dared listen. A week after her arrival, the children who played near the creek swore they saw her standing across the water, though she had been asleep in her room, the light of her lamp visible through the shuttered window. They described her eyes, calm and unreadable, as she lifted a small hand in greeting, and then she vanished, leaving only the ripple of water and the echo of their own voices. By the time summer arrived, a tension had settled over Ash Hollow. It was subtle at first. Livestock found dead in the fields without marks. Doors closed in the night that had been open in the evening. Windows rattling though no wind had passed. People began speaking in hushed tones of the teacher who appeared at places she should not have been, whose shadow lingered where shadows ought not to stretch. A child would go missing for a half hour and return clutching a ribbon, claiming it had been given by a woman with hair dark as the river at dusk. The townsfolk dismissed these accounts publicly, but their eyes shifted constantly, their steps measured, their hands itching to reach for tools or lanterns, even in the safe light of day. It was during this first summer that Clara fell ill. A fever, sudden and sharp, took hold of her within a week, and the town reacted with a mixture of dread and resignation. They had seen enough in their lives to know when illness brought more than just weakness. The schoolhouse closed for days, and neighbors whispered of the teacher who had come to educate children, and instead had brought an unknowable disturbance into their midst. But when the fever broke, Clara rose, pale and quiet, moving through her room as if nothing had happened. The valley, however, seemed changed. The air pressed heavier against the chest of anyone walking the ridge, and the fog carried whispers that no one dared identify. The first burial occurred in early autumn, prompted not by her illness but by accident, a misstep on the rocky ridge that left her unconscious. The townsfolk, fearful of contagion, and yet bound by a need to follow procedure, placed her in a coffin temporarily, awaiting word from authorities who never came. She remained there, laid to rest among the fallen leaves and the early frost, and the community returned to their routines, though a quiet unease had settled over Ash Hollow. When the caretaker returned in the morning, the coffin was in place, the earth covering it, yet the soil had shifted slightly, as though it had remembered the weight that had lain upon it. No one spoke aloud about it, not a word. And yet, in the days that followed, Clara was seen. She appeared on the ridge road where she had been buried, her figure obscured by fog, hands folded before her, eyes calm and unwavering. Those who glimpsed her described a sensation that pressed into their chests, a quiet insistence that she was there, that she had returned, and that she would not leave. Livestock became restless. The air itself seemed to linger in unnatural patterns, and letters delivered across the hollow arrived damp or smudged, their contents rearranged in ways that made no sense. A child claimed to have been spoken to by Clara while she sat alone in a locked cabin, and yet the woman's room was empty. The community began to fracture. Doors were bolted at night, windows shuttered, and even routine travel across the hollow became measured, careful, as if the paths themselves could be treacherous to the unwary. Yet the more precautions they took, the more persistent her presence became. And in every account, whether from children, adults, or those passing through the hollow briefly, one detail remained constant. Clara Hensley, the woman buried twice, continued to appear, moving through the valley as if claiming a space that should have been denied her, shaping the hollow in ways that were quiet, subtle, and impossible to deny. It is impossible to state with certainty what occurred in Ash Hollow during that first year. The official records provide no clarity. Diaries were scarce, letters incomplete. But the oral accounts, the fragmented recollections, and the memory of the valley itself point toward an understanding that something beyond the ordinary had taken place. Something that left its mark on the hills, on the people, and on the stories that would be passed down in whispers long after the cabins crumbled and the families dispersed. And so, the valley held its breath. The fog wrapped tighter around the ridges. The creek murmured with a sound that resembled speech. The leaves rustled in patterns that the townsfolk could not explain. And for anyone walking the hollow at dusk, there was a sense, unmistakable and enduring, that Clara Hensley, the woman buried twice, still watched, still waited, still returned. As the days bled into weeks, the presence of Clara Hensley became increasingly insistent. It began in subtle ways at first, shadows falling in places where no one should be, whispers that seemed to travel through the hollow when the wind shifted. Children returning from school reported glimpses of a figure on the ridge road, distant yet distinct, carrying herself with the same quiet dignity she had always shown, but moving with an unnatural certainty, as though she understood paths through the fog that no living person could discern. The adults, though skeptical by nature, began to notice small anomalies in their daily lives. Tools left out to dry would vanish overnight, only to be found days later leaning against a tree, scrubbed clean, as though someone had taken the time to put them away. Livestock refused to feed near the creek, huddling in corners of the pasture, eyes wide and unblinking, a sense of unease radiating from them that was impossible to explain. Letters meant for neighbors were delayed, misdelivered or returned with content rearranged in ways that made no sense. One miner, returning from the tunnels, claimed to hear the soft hum of a lullaby drifting from the direction of the old schoolhouse, though Clara had not taught for days, and no one lived in the building. The melody was familiar, yet impossible to place, and it lingered in the mind long after the sound had faded. A subtle insistence that something was watching, waiting, present beyond the boundaries of reason. Even the paths themselves seemed to bend in her presence. Walkers reported that familiar roads led them in circles, bringing them back to the schoolhouse or the cemetery when they had intended to walk toward the river or the mine. Objects moved subtly from their previous positions. A fence post leaned differently. A stone marker shifted slightly. It was as if the holler itself recognized her return and adjusted its landscape in response, a quiet, unyielding acknowledgement of her existence. Clara herself, during this period, became increasingly withdrawn. She spoke less to the townsfolk, spending hours alone in her room, writing in journals and letters that no one ever received. In those writings, she hinted at dreams that mirrored the strange occurrences around her. Dreams of being buried, of rising from the soil, of walking the ridge road while the world slept, unseen yet present. She mentioned hearing the distant laughter of children and the quiet sighs of adults, voices of people long gone or imagined, and she recorded these events with a precision that suggested awareness beyond mere observation. The townsfolk grew cautious. They began walking the paths with measured steps, locking doors and shuttering windows even during the day. Miners refused to leave their cabins after work, fearing the fog that curled along the ridge might carry her figure to them. Families that had lived in Ash Hollow for generations moved quietly, teaching their children to respect the presence that they could neither name nor understand. Over time, sightings became more precise. Neighbors swore they saw Clara moving along the ridge, lantern in hand, though no one could explain how she traversed the distance between her cabin and the ridge without leaving footprints. Others reported glimpses of her at the cemetery at night, standing over her own grave, yet the coffin remained firmly sealed. Some described a feeling of weight pressing against their chest, a deep, instinctive understanding that they were in the presence of something that did not belong entirely to the world of the living. Stories circulated quietly, each retelling adding detail while retaining the essential mystery. A child described a woman with soft eyes lifting a fallen branch from the creek to help a younger sibling, only to vanish moments later. A miner returning from the tunnel recounted seeing a figure at the chapel steps, singing a hymn in a voice that seemed both near and impossibly distant. These stories were fragmented, inconsistent in small ways, yet consistent in one undeniable fact. Clara Hensley, the woman buried twice, had returned. By the time autumn settled over the valley, the tension in Ash Hollow was nearly tangible. Fog rolled through the hollow with an unnatural persistence, covering the ridge road in a thick, silent blanket. The children dared not play near the schoolhouse alone. Livestock shied away from fields they had grazed for years. Adults avoided the cemetery, leaving flowers unplaced and markers unvisited. The valley had become a place of quiet observation, the townsfolk moving carefully through the days, as though avoiding the notice of something they could not see, yet could not ignore. And then the caretaker made the discovery that would cement the valley's unease. Returning to inspect the first burial, he found the soil shifted, the coffin slightly misaligned, yet the nails and wood remained unbroken. He could not explain it, and when he mentioned it to the minister, the words faltered in his throat. The minister listened in silence, his expression guarded, and advised the man to leave it alone. Some matters, he said, were not meant for conversation, but observation could not be avoided. Over the following nights, Clara was seen again, appearing in the fog along the ridge, walking the paths she had never walked before, appearing where she had been buried, moving in ways that defied reason. No one attempted to stop her. Some fled the hollow entirely, unable to reconcile the presence of a living figure where none should exist. Others stayed, curious or desperate to understand, only to find themselves haunted by her movements, her silence, and the persistent, unrelenting knowledge that she had returned. It was during one particularly cold night, when the wind carried the scent of frost across the hollow, and the moonlight barely touched the valley floor, that the first serious confrontation occurred. The caretaker, armed with a lantern, approached the cemetery once more, hoping to witness the truth firsthand. He saw the figure of Clara standing atop the ridge, hands folded in front of her, eyes fixed on the coffin she had been placed in weeks before. The wind shifted, the fog moved, and when he stepped forward, she was gone. Only the soil, slightly unsettled, remained to indicate her presence. The encounter marked a turning point. The townsfolk no longer whispered merely out of caution. They spoke in quiet fear. They stopped leaving objects unattended, locking doors even in the light of day, and avoiding paths that led toward the ridge. The valley itself seemed to recognize the change, the fog thickening at dusk, the winds carrying a quiet warning through the trees, and the creek murmuring in patterns that suggested consciousness rather than chance. Clara Hensley had returned, and with her return, Ash Hollow began to unravel. The first true moment of horror unfolded on a night when the moon had not risen, leaving the hollow in a darkness so complete that the familiar paths disappeared entirely. A few brave townsfolk, driven by curiosity or perhaps disbelief, ventured toward the cemetery. Their lanterns cast long, flickering shadows, yet the moment they stepped past the edge of the ridge road, the world seemed to shift. Objects they recognized, stones, fence posts, trees, were subtly altered. Shapes that should have been stationary twisted in ways that could not be explained, and every step felt as though the valley itself resisted them. It was the caretaker who first encountered her. He had arrived at the cemetery with a lantern in hand, intending to confirm the earlier disturbances, to finally understand what had taken root in their hollow. And there she was. Clara stood atop the ridge, her posture still, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the coffin where she had been buried weeks before. The fog curled around her like fingers, but she did not move as the wind shifted. There was no sound of her footsteps, no breath visible in the chill night air, yet every instinct told him she was there in a way that defied explanation. He called her name, hoping for a response, some acknowledgement, some sign that this was real. And for a moment, the hollow held its breath. Then she moved, slowly. Not across the ground, but as though the very mist carried her, her figure gliding above the earth in a manner that made the trees themselves seem to bow in recognition. The caretaker stumbled backward, unable to comprehend what he saw. He felt the press of the valley in his chest, the kind of weight that leaves one breathless, and when he lifted his lantern, she was gone. But she left evidence. The earth where she had stood was slightly disturbed, as if her presence had pressed into the soil without physically touching it. The grass leaned unnaturally, footprints formed in the mud, though no one had walked there, and the faintest whisper of her voice carried across the hollow. A melody, soft and persistent, hummed in the spaces between the trees. It was the same lullaby that the children had described, that miners had heard at the chapel steps, now amplified, persistent, undeniable. Over the following nights, Clara's appearances grew more precise and more audacious. She would be seen walking the ridge road when the fog was thickest, reaching the schoolhouse in moments that should have taken hours. Shadows elongated unnaturally as she passed, stretching along walls and across fields, lingering after her departure. Those who glimpsed her could not explain the sensation that followed. An awareness that she observed every movement, every step, every heartbeat, though no living being could exist in that spot without notice. One evening, a family returning from the mine claimed to see her standing beside the creek, holding their youngest child in her arms. The child was unharmed, though trembling, whispering of the woman who had smiled at her, yet vanished before the parents could intervene. On another night, a group of teenagers exploring the ridge encountered her at the old chapel steps. She was singing again, a melody so hauntingly beautiful that one boy fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face, unable to move or speak until she had disappeared. In every account, her presence was immediate, silent, commanding, yet never overtly violent, an impossible balance between comfort and terror. The townsfolk began to whisper of impossible events within their own homes. Doors closed by themselves. Objects moved. Children awoke in the middle of the night, murmuring words they could not understand. Even those who slept alone claimed to feel a cold hand brush their hair, a light pressure on the chest, a subtle shift in the air that suggested she was near, observing, waiting. Fear took root in the valley, in a way that could not be measured or explained, spreading quietly from house to house, settling in the hollows between heartbeats. And then came the most harrowing discovery: the second burial. The minister, urged by fear and desperation, attempted to secure the coffin with heavy timbers and thick nails, believing that the first disturbance had been a fluke, that the valley itself could be satisfied once the earth was properly sealed. But when he returned the next day, the nails were twisted, the coffin slightly ajar, and the soil pressed down in a way that suggested a weight far beyond that of any human body. Those who approached felt the same pressing weight, the same quiet insistence of presence that could not be named, only felt. By the time the first frost coated the ridges and the creek began to stiffen with ice, the valley was transformed. Ash Hollow no longer resembled the safe, ordinary town it had been. Every shadow carried the possibility of her presence, every breeze whispered her name, and every path promised to reveal a glimpse of something beyond comprehension. Townsfolk began to vanish for hours at a time, returning disoriented or with stories they could not fully recount. Diaries recorded faint melodies in the fog, objects moving on their own, and glimpses of a figure in the distance, with impossible clarity and silent intent. It became undeniable. Clara Hensley had returned, and with her return, the ordinary world of the hollow had fractured. The valley was no longer a place of safety or reason. It was a domain shaped by her presence, responsive, aware, and wholly other. And for those who remained, the question was no longer whether she existed, but what she intended, and whether anyone could endure the truth of her presence. As the winter deepened in the Virginia Appalachians, Ash Hollow existed in a state between memory and reality. The ridge roads twisted under frost and shadow, and the fog lingered longer each day, curling through the hollow like a living presence. Life in the hollow had become an exercise in vigilance. Every footstep, every creaking board, every whisper of wind demanded attention, lest one encounter her. The townsfolk who remained avoided speaking of Clara directly, yet her presence was inescapable. The children, who had once played in the creek and along the paths leading to the schoolhouse, now remained indoors, tracing the edges of their rooms, ears straining for any sound that might indicate her approach. Parents whispered to them in low tones, instructing them to be still, to pretend the world was normal, though no one could articulate why such caution was necessary. Adults, too, carried the weight of her return. Miners worked the tunnels in silence, fearing to speak for fear that the air itself might carry their words to her. Neighbors passed each other on the ridge roads with quick, downward glances, avoiding eye contact, as if recognition itself might draw her attention. It was during this period that the full psychological toll of her presence became apparent. People began to doubt their own perceptions. A mother would swear she saw Clara in her kitchen, rearranging dishes, only to find the room untouched when she called for her children. A farmer would glimpse a figure walking alongside his livestock. Yet when he approached, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint impression of movement in the frost. Even the natural world seemed complicit in the disruption. Birds refused to settle in the trees near the ridge road. Animals that had long roamed freely became skittish, restless, and in some cases vanished entirely. Rumors spread quietly, and while no one spoke of it openly, every household had a story to tell. A child disappeared for nearly an hour, returning with mud on their shoes and a dazed expression, muttering about a woman with dark hair, who had spoken in a language the child could not understand. A miner awoke to find his tools neatly arranged in patterns he did not recognize, and though he tried to dismiss it as sleepwalking, the unease in his chest suggested otherwise. Sleep itself became a tenuous refuge. Dreams of Clara were vivid and inescapable, merging seamlessly with reality. Those who slept in the cabins closest to the cemetery reported waking to find her standing at the foot of their bed, silent, hands folded, eyes unwavering, only to vanish when the morning light pierced the frost. Letters and diaries became the only tangible record of these occurrences. A teacher from a neighboring town, visiting Ash Hollow briefly, wrote of seeing a figure on the ridge, moving in ways that defied the weight of gravity, and hearing a melody that belonged to no known song. Her account was met with disbelief elsewhere, yet within the hollow, it was consistent with the experiences of every living resident. Diaries recorded the same details, over and over. The fog that lingered longer than nature allowed, the cold that pressed against the skin without explanation, the faint sensation of eyes observing from the shadows, and the figure of Clara, appearing and disappearing at will, unaffected by the barriers of the physical world. Over time, Ash Hollow became a place of avoidance and quiet terror. Paths that had once connected homes and fields fell into disuse, overtaken by moss and creeping roots. Families who could afford to leave the valley did so, traveling miles away, yet returning only once or twice to gather belongings or check on property. Those who remained moved slowly, speaking in whispers, avoiding open spaces, and walking as though each step might awaken something slumbering. Even the church, a place of solace in the hollow, was approached with trepidation. Parishioners whispered that Clara's presence lingered in the pews, her gaze following them even when the chapel was empty. It was during this period that the phenomenon of repeated appearances reached its apex. People reported seeing her in places she had never been, yet everywhere she appeared carried the same undeniable weight of familiarity. A young boy claimed she walked beside him along the ridge, pointing silently toward a hidden path. An elderly widow recounted seeing Clara at the edge of her garden, gently touching each plant, yet leaving no footprints in the frozen soil. The air itself seemed to carry her, pressing against the chest and throat of anyone venturing out, a constant reminder that her presence was not fleeting or accidental. With each sighting, the valley grew quieter. The fog became almost permanent, coiling around the hollow, muffling sound and dampening light. The creek's murmurs took on a rhythm that seemed deliberate, carrying a tone that those who listened closely described as a warning, or perhaps a lament. Trees along the ridge groaned in the wind, creaking as though under strain, and shadows stretched unnaturally, creating the impression of movement even when the land itself remained still. People began to doubt whether they had seen Clara or imagined her entirely, but the evidence persisted. Disturbed soil, shifted objects, glimpses of a figure at impossible distances, and the unshakable sense of being observed. As winter waned and spring approached, the hollow became a place of rumor and legend. The remaining residents spoke little, but those who ventured close to the ridge would report seeing her moving in ways that defied explanation. She was sometimes accompanied by faint melodies, other times silent, yet always present. Families fled when they could, yet even those who left carried the memory of her, an imprint on their psyche that persisted long after they returned to distant towns and cities. By midsummer, Ash Hollow was nearly abandoned. The few remaining families existed in a delicate balance, moving slowly, keeping fires lit even during the day, and avoiding the ridge road at all costs. Those who dared walk near the cemetery claimed that the earth around her grave shifted without warning, and that when they called out her name, the valley itself seemed to answer, carrying the sound of a voice that was not their own. The cemetery became a place of ritualized avoidance, the hollow's collective consciousness shaping itself around the inevitability of her presence. Throughout this long descent, Clara Hensley was no longer merely a teacher, a woman buried twice. She had become something beyond comprehension, a force that shaped the valley, altered perception, and imposed a weight of fear that no measure of rationality could dispel. And for anyone remaining in Ash Hollow, the question was no longer whether she existed or whether her return was real. It was whether they could endure the presence of a living memory that had become more powerful than death itself. By the time summer fully surrendered to the approach of autumn once more, Ash Hollow was no longer a town in any ordinary sense. Cabins stood empty, doors creaking in the wind, windows shuttered against the unseen presence that lingered in every corner of the valley. The few remaining residents moved like shadows themselves, careful to avoid the ridge, the schoolhouse, even the creek where Clara had first been glimpsed. Their lives had become a series of rituals, small, deliberate acts to survive the intangible weight pressing upon the hollow. Those who had left carried with them a sense of unease that could not be dispelled. Travelers reported dreams of a woman with dark hair and calm eyes, walking beside them along paths they knew well, whispering words they could not remember in the morning. Some claimed to hear her lullaby faintly in the breeze, carrying across fields and valleys far beyond the hollow itself. Letters sent from these towns spoke of homes left in meticulous order, as though someone or something had ensured that nothing remained out of place. And yet the handwriting of the returned notes was unfamiliar, precise, and unnerving. For those who stayed, life became a delicate negotiation with reality itself. Every morning, they awoke anticipating her presence, checking rooms, doors, and the land around them for signs, any subtle anomaly that might betray her proximity. Livestock continued to behave erratically, children were subdued, and even adults found themselves whispering to one another in hushed tones, carefully avoiding full sentences lest the wrong words draw her attention. Yet she was never overtly threatening. She did not harm, at least in the conventional sense, but the persistence of her existence was itself a form of terror. Proof that the boundary between life and death, between ordinary perception and something else entirely, was no longer secure. Some claimed to have glimpsed her in the forest at dawn, walking the ridge with her lantern, each step precise, deliberate, yet leaving no trace. Others found objects in their homes moved with care, placed in patterns they could not comprehend. One woman reported that her mirror reflected a second image, a faint presence standing behind her, composed entirely of shadow, yet unmistakably human in form. She described the eyes as calm, unwavering, and impossibly old, as though time itself had passed through them. Ash Hollow became a repository of stories that could not be fully verified. Diaries, letters, and oral accounts hinted at events beyond reason. Sightings of Clara in multiple places at once, melodies echoing through the trees, animals behaving as though aware of an unseen observer. The hollow itself seemed to participate in these occurrences, the fog, the wind, and even the creek's murmur carrying the weight of her presence. Nothing in the valley could escape her influence. As the years passed, the few remaining inhabitants aged in quiet fear. Children who had once whispered about her became adults who whispered to themselves, recounting events that had occurred decades before. The ridge road remained untouched, the cemetery unvisited, and the cabins fell slowly into disrepair, overtaken by nature and the persistent fog. And still, Clara appeared. Not always visible, but always present. In dreams, in shadows, in the shifting patterns of the land, she moved as if the hollow itself were a part of her, shaped by her will, aware of her observation. Those who sought to leave carried the memory with them, yet it followed. A farmer who had moved to Richmond reported waking in the night to hear the faintest strains of her melody, drifting through his open window. A teacher, now grown and long removed from the hollow, described a shadow glimpsed in a distant forest, perfectly still, waiting, watching, calm and deliberate. In every account, one detail remained consistent. Clara Hensley, the woman buried twice, had transcended the ordinary constraints of life and death, leaving only questions and the quiet terror of knowing that some presences cannot be banished. In the end, Ash Hollow stands today as a place of memory and warning. The valley remains overgrown and quiet, yet those who pass through the ridge occasionally report a figure among the fog, a calm, unmoving presence, with eyes that seem to follow, waiting. Children still whisper the name Clara Hensley when they sense the wind shift or the creek murmur. Travelers feel the weight of unseen observation in the hollow, a subtle insistence that someone, or something, remains, watching, patient, and eternal. The story ends not with a resolution, but with the echo of her existence. There is no final confrontation, no return to normalcy, no clear explanation. Only the persistent awareness that the boundary between the living and the remembered, between ordinary and inexplicable, is not as firm as we believe. Clara Hensley's return was not a fleeting incident. It was the opening of a chapter in which Ash Hollow, and all who passed through it, were forced to reckon with the reality of a presence that could not be confined, dismissed, or forgotten. And so, the hollow waits. The fog curls through the ridge roads, the creek murmurs with voices beyond understanding, and the land remembers her steps. Some nights, when the wind shifts just right, the faintest melody drifts across the valley, soft, deliberate, and unmistakably human, and those who hear it understand without question that Clara Hensley, the woman buried twice, is still there, watching, waiting, enduring in ways that neither time nor death can undo.